The greatest rivalry in the history of chess, and I don't think it's close, is between Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov. Basically, for probably around 25 years, those two players were either number one or number two in the world. They played hundreds of games against each other, many world championship matches, and the legacy they left us is one of the greatest chess legacies in existence. Now, Karpov was hard to beat, even for Kasparov, but every once in a while, he had a breakthrough in one of his classical attacking games. This is one of those. Karpov has white, Kasparov has black. This was played at Linares in 1993. Let us jump right in. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and bishop to g7. Some of you will remember back when world champions played the King's Indian defense. e4, d6, and f3. So Karpov plays what is known as the Zamish or Samish variation against the King's Indian defense. And basically, it makes this e4 point really, really strong. So this is a very sturdy, rigid pawn structure in the center. The downside is that this knight and this bishop can get in each other's way because the knight doesn't have its natural development square on f3. So if it moves to e2, it blocks the bishop in. If the bishop tries to develop first, it blocks the queen's defense of the d4 square. So it's kind of a house of cards, and it's not easy to get those two pieces developed very well. And that is an issue in this game. Castles for Kasparov, bishop to e3, defending d4, but also preparing to play queen to d2 and bishop h6, exchanging off the powerful dark squared bishop. e5, and d5 is very common. Karpov probably wanted to avoid these kind of Mar-del-Plata structures where black ends up playing f5. Kasparov, really excelled in those structures. So Karpov plays knight g to e2 and defends d4, but of course does block in his bishop at f1. c6 keeps a knight out of d5, also allows Kasparov's queen to develop. Queen to d2, continuing his development. Knight b to d7, and Kasparov wants to play on the dark squares, take on d4, perhaps even knight d to c5. But here Karpov makes a very committal decision. Instead of castling queenside, he plays rook to d1 to put pressure down this d file. He'd like to open that up and put some pressure down the d file. The problem is, of course, Karpov's king is still at least 3 moves away from castling. a6 is played by Kasparov. One of the problems with this knight, it blocks this bishop's defense of c4, so Kasparov prepares to attack the square directly. Pawn takes, and Kasparov doesn't want to play a symmetrical structure with exchanges down the d-file, so he takes with his knight. By the way, it would be a mistake to take the pawn on d6 here for Karpov, because after queen takes, rook takes queen, knight to c4, and you're attacking b2, the bishop, and the rook, and black is just clearly better there. So first Karpov defends the c4 pawn, but Kasparov continues his plan, attacks the c4 pawn, and again, queen d6, it's better here than it was in the last variation, but black still gets plenty of good play in this position. So Karpov first takes on b5, so he doesn't have to worry about c4 being vulnerable. But we now see, after Kasparov retakes, that he has a lot of active pieces. His bishop is active on the long diagonal. The rook at a8 is putting pressure on a2 on the half-open file. Kasparov is getting good piece play here. So now Karpov goes ahead and takes on d6. And we know Kasparov is not going to exchange queens here. His main goal is to get at white's king. So he plays knight f to d7 and prevents that exchange. And we see this knight is defending the c6 pawn. So Karpov's move is very natural. He plays f4 to kick this knight away and weaken the defense of this pawn. But we see Kasparov do something here that he does a lot in this game. He counterattacks. He doesn't retreat when his pieces are attacked, and he plays b4 himself instead. He doesn't move that knight. He kicks Karpov's knight away. If he were to go ahead and just take that knight, then after pawn takes, knight c3, bishop e2, queen to d2, this would probably have been better for Karpov in the game, but Kasparov's going to be very happy with this position with these weak dark squares, and again, this king on e1. But Karpov instead plays knight to b1. So he retreats, and now Kasparov plays the knight to g4, hitting the bishop at e3. That bishop goes to d4. Karpov wants to trade off that nice dark squared bishop. bishop d4, queen d4, but rook takes a2. So Kasparov has regained the pawn that Karpov had initially won on d6. So now the material is equal. So Karpov kicks the knight. One of the downsides, though, of a move like this, it can make this diagonal, this h4, e1 diagonal, a bit sensitive. And again, Kasparov does not retreat his knight, but instead he plays c5, attacking the queen and also potentially playing bishop to b7 to hit e4 and attack down that light square diagonal. Here, Karpov plays queen to g1. Now, the idea is to keep this knight at g4 out of e3. However, it turns out that queen to d3 was a bit better, and we'll see why in a second. After queen to g1, knight g to f6, and Kasparov is attacking e4. If the queen were on d3, that pawn would be defended. But here he advances it, and again, because the queen is at g1, Kasparov is able to place his knight on e4. It's not currently defended, but it's not attacked either, and it's very well placed on e4. We see this knight controlling these key squares around White's king. So potentially, Kasparov could cause some problems with queen to h4 check, as we mentioned. It's not quite a threat yet, but Karpov doesn't like it hovering over the board, so he plays h4. But this is a pawn move, and it is weakening also, particularly this g4 square. So Kasparov plays c4. He is marching his queen side majority forward. If Karpov takes that pawn, then b3 is played, and now this queen can go to a5 and deliver check on the other side of the board. After, say, queen to e3 to try to block that check with the knight, knight d to c5, and black's pieces are way too active. The bishop is going to g4, and Karpov wants no part of that position. So instead he plays the knight to c1, attacking Kasparov's rook on a2. And again, we talked about how Kasparov doesn't retreat if he can possibly help it. So he leaves his rook on a2 and lets Karpov take it. He plays c3. But he himself is threatening c2, which would fork the rook and the knight. Karpov does go ahead and take that rook. Now c2, forking the rook and the knight. And now queen to d4 was played, giving the rook back. What if he tries to hold on to that rook with rook to c1? Well, the problem then is this sacrificial idea. Knight takes e5. What that does, it opens up the queen to aim towards the king, and the threat is after pawn takes, promote to a queen, and then checkmate. So that is the problem with just trying to save the rook. So Karpov goes ahead and plays queen to d4, taking the rook. And here he takes with the king, which is a good decision. If he takes with the queen, then queen to a5, attacks the knight at a2. If the knight goes to c1, this same idea again. Knight takes e5, opening up the center after fe5, queen e5, setting up discoveries along the e-file to hit the king. A move like, here, this would win the queen. So if he blocks with the knight, for example, then rook to e8 continues to pile on. If queen to d4, queen takes, knight to g3 check, picking up the rook at h1. And if he blocks with the bishop, that's even worse, because queen to g3 check, and it is mate. So that is why Karpov goes ahead and takes with his king instead of his queen. But now knight d to c5. Kasparov is now willing to part with his queen and exchange them, but that's because his pieces are so active, it doesn't even matter. And he's also potentially threatening knight to f2 check, winning the rook. So queens do come off, the king goes to c2, and now knight to f2, attacking the rook on h1. And in this position, Karpov resigned, and he is lost. And let's look and see why. If he plays rook to h3, then bishop to f5 check leads to some of the variations we're going to look at here in a second. Notice he can't block the check because there's just too many active pieces. But let's say rook to g1. Okay. Bishop to f5 check. If king to c1, rook to d1 check, king to b2, rook takes b1 is checkmate. We see the bishop controlling this diagonal, this pawn controlling these two squares. So that is mate. If instead king to b2, then knight to d1 check. And if king to c1, knight takes b3 is mate. All four of these pieces are involved in the mate. The rook controlling the file, the bishop controlling this diagonal, this square. And if instead king to a1, same thing. Knight takes b3 is mate. Rarely do we see an attacking game against Karpov like this, but when it happens, it's usually always Garry Kasparov. I hope you've enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.